Throughout this series, we've documented what the Heritage Foundation has done. The 50-year plan, the personnel pipelines, the policy capture, the assault on education. But we haven't fully answered the question of why. Why does this network hold together? Why do people dedicate their lives to dismantling programs that help their neighbors? Why does the grievance never end, even when they win? The answer lies in a psychological phenomenon called collective narcissism. If you heard the last series, it should sound familiar. For those who haven't, we'll start with a primer. Then we'll link the two series. Because these aren't two distinct problems. They're actually parts of the same whole. And understanding it is the first step toward defeating it. I'm Sarah, and this is Ethos Trek. And this is the final episode of the Heritage Playbook, Breaking the Mirror. If you didn't listen to the previous series on collective narcissism, let me introduce you to the research of Dr. Agnieszka Golec de Zavala, a political psychologist who has spent decades studying collective narcissism. Collective narcissism is the belief that your group, your nation, your movement, your political tribe is exceptional, but that exceptionality is not sufficiently recognized by others. It's different from healthy group pride. You can love your country, feel connected to your community, take pride in shared achievements. That's called in-group satisfaction, and it's psychologically healthy. Collective narcissism is something else. It's characterized by an insatiable need for external validation. The group's greatness must be constantly affirmed. Any criticism, any challenge, any perceived slight becomes an existential threat. And here's the crucial finding. Collective narcissism predicts intergroup hostility, conspiracy thinking, and support for authoritarian leaders. Not group pride, specifically the narcissistic form of group attachment. Collective narcissism creates a specific type of relationship between leaders and followers. Political psychologist Gerald Post described it as a relationship between, quote, mirror-hungry, unquote, leaders and, quote, ideal-hungry, unquote, followers. The mirror-hungry leader needs constant admiration. Their sense of self depends on being reflected back as great, powerful, exceptional. The ideal-hungry follower needs something to believe in. They've invested their own sense of self-worth in the group's greatness. When the leader is validated, they feel validated. This creates a feedback loop. The leader makes grandiose claims about the group. The followers feel affirmed. Any challenge to the leader becomes an attack on the follower's own identity. Sound familiar? Here's what makes collective narcissism so dangerous politically. The hypersensitivity to threat. Research shows that collective narcissists perceive threats even in situations that require, quote, a stretch of the imagination to be perceived as insulting or threatening, unquote. The war on Christmas. The, quote, great replacement, unquote. The claim that America is being, quote, taken away. These aren't responses to real threats. They're the projections of a narcissistic group identity that requires constant enemies to maintain cohesion. And this is the mechanism that Heritage and its allies have exploited for 50 years. They didn't just build policy infrastructure. They built grievance infrastructure. The message is always the same. Your country is exceptional. It's under attack. Only we can save it. Let's connect this framework to what we've documented. The Powell Memo begins with a threat narrative. Quote, "The American economic system is under broad attack," unquote. The business community is being persecuted. Consumer advocates, environmentalists, civil rights activists, they're all enemies. Heritage's founding mythology centers on grievance. The founders believed in communist conspiracies. They saw civil rights as an attack on traditional America. Every mandate for leadership frames policy as warfare. It's not, quote, "Here are some ideas for governance," unquote. It's, quote, "Here's how to defeat the enemies who have captured your government," unquote. Project 2025 explicitly calls for, quote, "dismantling the administrative state," unquote, language that frames career civil servants as enemies to be purged. This isn't just ideology. It's the cultivation of collective narcissism as a political strategy. And it works. Research shows that collective narcissism is associated with support for populist leaders, hostility toward outgroups, and willingness to support undemocratic means to achieve group goals. If you've ever tried to argue with someone deep in this worldview, you know that facts don't help. That's not because they're stupid. It's because of how collective narcissism processes information. When you challenge a belief that's tied to someone's group identity, and through that group to their sense of self, you're not engaging in intellectual debate. You're threatening their psychological integrity. The research is clear. Direct confrontation, fact-checking, ridicule, these approaches often strengthen collective narcissism rather than weakening it. The group closes ranks. The challenge is reframed as persecution. The grievance deepens. This is why 50 years of demonstrating that Heritage's policies harm ordinary Americans hasn't stopped them. The facts aren't the point. The identity is the point. So what works? What do we do? The research suggests several approaches that can actually reduce collective narcissism. First, differentiate the group from the narcissistic attachment to it. People can love their country without needing it to be, quote, "the greatest," unquote. They can take pride in their community without requiring enemies to define against. This means offering alternative narratives about group identity, ones that are based on shared values and genuine achievements rather than grievance and superiority. Second, address the underlying insecurity. Collective narcissism is associated with low self-esteem. People turn to grandiose group identities when their individual sense of worth feels threatened. Economic anxiety, status threat, rapid social change, these create conditions where collective narcissism flourishes. Addressing material conditions isn't just good policy, it's counter-radicalization. Third, build alternative communities. People need belonging. If the only source of meaning and community comes from organizations cultivating grievance, that's where people will go. The answer isn't to isolate people from their current communities. It's to create competing sources of connection and purpose. Fourth, focus on movable middles, not true believers. Research suggests that the core of any collective narcissistic movement is relatively small, but they're amplified by people who are loosely attached, who've absorbed some of the rhetoric, but aren't fully committed. Those people can be reached, not by attacking their identity, but by offering alternative frameworks for understanding their genuine concerns. Systemic responses. Individual conversations matter, but we also need systemic responses. Transparency. Dark money enables these networks. Requiring disclosure of political funding, including think tank funding, would expose the machinery. Civic education. Understanding how government actually works, how policy is made, how manipulation operates. These are skills that should be universal. Media literacy. The ability to identify source bias, funding influences, and propaganda techniques needs to be taught systematically. Counter-infrastructure. For 50 years, Heritage has built institutions. Progressive organizations need to match that investment, not in grievance, but in genuine policy development and civic engagement. Long-term thinking. Heritage plays the long game. They think in decades. Matching their persistence means building institutions that will outlast any single election. Reflection questions? Final questions for this series. First, have you ever felt the pull of collective narcissism? The appeal of belonging to something exceptional that's under attack? What need was that meeting? Second, what alternative sources of meaning, community, and identity do you have? If those were strengthened, would you need the grievance narratives less? Third, the Heritage Network has been building for 50 years. What are you willing to commit to for the next 50 years? Concrete actions you can take. These are long-term commitments. 1. Find or build your counter community. Join an organization that does the work, not just commentary, but actual policy development, civic engagement, or community building. 2. Commit to civic education. If you have children or young people in your life, teach them how government works. Make them immune to manipulation. 3. Support investigative journalism financially, if you can. The work of exposing these networks requires resources. If you have the means, become a sustaining member of at least one outlet. 4. Run for something. School board, city council, state legislature. The Heritage Pipeline works because they have people ready. We need people ready too. 5. Think in decades. Pick one issue. Education, voting rights, whatever matters to you, and commit to working on it for the rest of your life. We've covered a lot of ground in this series. We started with a memo written in 1971 by a corporate lawyer worried about consumer advocates. We traced how that memo inspired the creation of an institutional network designed to capture American government. We watched as that network delivered a blueprint to Ronald Reagan and saw 60% of it implemented within a year. We documented the 44-year campaign to eliminate the Department of Education, a campaign that may finally be succeeding. We examined how Title IX was rewritten to favor the organizations that had been building the case for years. And we explored the psychology that binds these movements together, the collective narcissism that requires endless enemies and endless grievance. Here's what I want you to take away. This is not inevitable. These are choices made by people, funded by money, implemented through institutions. And choices can be countered. But it requires the same thing Heritage understood 50 years ago: persistence, infrastructure, and the willingness to play the long game. The question isn't whether we can win. The question is whether we're willing to match their commitment. Now, go do something about it. I'm Sarah. This is Ethos Trek. This has been the Heritage Playbook series. All longer videos in this series will be in a playlist. As usual, all references will be in the Substack companion. I'll be back in a few days. If you like this content, please like the video. Consider subscribing. Share if there's someone you think should hear this. Leave a comment and keep the conversation going. Thank you for listening.